Okay, so we are going to go through your chapter 35, section 8 notes over the atomic bombs and Japan's defeat. And the second section that you're responsible for is the Allies are triumphant, the Allies triumphant. And so we'll go through these, make sure you get these notes either in wherever you take notes, either in a Google Doc or an actual notebook. First slide for you here is the atomic bombs and Japan's defeat. So where we last left off, Europe was out of the picture. Hitler had committed suicide, FDR had died, and now Harry Truman was president. And so the full attention of the Allied war effort against the Axis is obviously on Japan. And so America had been fighting with Japan in the Pacific since Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And at this point now, they're planning for an all-out invasion on the Japanese home island. In the beginning of the war, towards the beginning of the war, Albert Einstein had actually fled Europe and arrived in the United States. And he helped contribute to the United States' unlocking of the atomic bomb. And so he, along with a German scientist named Robert Oppenheimer, worked on what was called the Manhattan Project, which was the project that developed the atomic bomb. And so in its when it was first created, the bomb was going to be used on Germany, but at this point, Germany is out of the war, and so Japan becomes the target for this weapon. And so the United States does conduct a test actually on US soil in New Mexico of the bomb. And so we know that it works. And so we send notice to Japan, basically threatening them with total annihilation unless they decide to surrender, which they do not do. And so on August 6, 1945, one US plane flies over Japan and drops an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. When the bomb is dropped, 180,000 are killed, wounded, or missing. That killed is probably the most accurate term. In terms of missing, it's just because their bodies basically disintegrated. And so 70,000 of those 180 die immediately. In the days, weeks, months, even years after, 60,000 more die because of the radiation and burns as a result of the dropping of the bomb. So we drop an atomic bomb and we wait, and Japan does not do anything. At the same time, the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin are making good on the agreement that they reached with the United States and Great Britain to help in the war in Asia. And so 2 days after the bombing, Japan does not surrender, and the Soviet Union invades and starts fighting against Japan. The United States at this point probably does not want the Soviet Union's help, and the Soviet Union knows that. They just want to get in so that they can have some say-so in what is done with Japan after the war. And so on August 9th, we drop a second atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki, where 80,000 more people are killed or missing. And so the next day, Japan finally does surrender. So August 10th, 1945, Japan asks for peace. This is supposed to be an unconditional surrender. That's what the United States and Britain and the Soviet Union had discussed. But ultimately, Japan does ask for one condition, and that is that Emperor Hirohito be allowed to stay on the throne just as a purely symbolic leader. The United States does go ahead and agree to this, partially because they need the Japanese people to have something to buy into with the new government that they're going to install. And so by forcing everything to be gone from Japan, that buy-in may not exist. But Hirohito, being viewed as literally this godlike figure, would give them some reason to buy in to the future of Japan. So on September 2nd, official ceremonies are held to mark the surrender of Japan. And this results in, back home, the United States celebrating Victory in Japan Day, or Victory in Japan Day, or VJ Day, after what was the most horrible war in history that ended with the dropping of 2 atomic bombs. And so here is that surrender in picture form upon the USS Missouri in September of 1945. And so if you remember, the war started, official beginning of World War II was September 1st, 1939, with the German blitzkrieg on Poland. And so 6 years and 1 day later, the war is finally concluded with Japan surrendering. And so the last section you guys were responsible for was just kind of wrapping up World War II. And so while the war was obviously costly for the entire world in terms of both economic and loss of life, it was profitable for the United States. We suffered 1 million casualties. Much less were due to things like infections and uncared for wounds in previous wars because of new technology, penicillin being one of those, and new medical care. So we suffered 1 million casualties. About a quarter of those were deaths. The Soviet Union, in comparison, had 20 million people die during the war. And we've talked about the Holocaust numbers already. The actual physical landscape of Europe and Asia was destroyed, whereas the United States was basically untouched, with obviously the exception of Pearl Harbor. The continental United States had sustained very, very minimal damage. And so we're big and strong while the rest of the world is going to have to focus on rebuilding. The war allowed the United States' military leadership to flex their muscles as well as our industrial production. And so the war is over. We've got this giant industrial structure built up. And so now we can shift from war production to consumer production, which is where you have kind of the stereotypical 1950s post-war baby boom years, which we'll talk about, develops from that. And so during the war, the last bullet point there, American people preserved their precious liberties without serious impairment. So there were some things that FDR and Congress had done that limited the rights of citizens, but those were quickly returned to the citizens post-World War II. So there was no long-term giving up of freedoms by the people. And so that wraps up chapter 35, section 8, and actually chapter 35 altogether. And so we'll move into actually Canada's reaction to World War II here in a bit.